At 6:37 on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Seaman Second Class Herbert Raubig stood at the helm of the destroyer USS Ward, on patrol off the entrance to Pearl Harbor. The first Japanese bomb was 1 hour and 18 minutes away, and no one in the United States Navy knew it was coming. What Raubig saw was closer, a low, dark shape in the water behind the cargo ship Antares, holding station in her wake, following her toward the harbor mouth. He pointed it out to the quartermaster of the watch, Donald Gruning. Gruning put binoculars on it and called the officer of the deck. Lieutenant Junior Grade Oscar Gopner looked at it and called it a buoy. Then the buoy moved. Gopner sent for the captain. Lieutenant William Outerbridge had held command of this ship for 2 days. It was his first command after 14 years in the Navy, and this was his second morning at sea. He had been sleeping on a cot rigged in the chart house, and he arrived in seconds. In pajamas, a Japanese kimono, a life jacket, and a steel helmet from the First World War. At 6:40, he ordered general quarters, and men ran to the guns of a destroyer that was 23 years old. The Ward went from 5 knots to 25. Outerbridge considered ramming and decided against it. Submarine steel was tougher than the thin plating of a ship built in 1918. Overhead, a Navy patrol plane circled and dropped 2 smoke floats to mark the shape in the water. The shape kept its course. It never turned. It gave no sign it had seen the destroyer coming down on it at all. At 6:45, the forward gun fired at about 100 yards. The shell passed just over the submarine's conning tower and struck the sea beyond. The submarine did not dive and did not turn. Gun number 3, mounted amidships on the roof of the galley deckhouse, held on as the range closed to 50 yards. 50 yards is not naval gunnery. 50 yards is across a street. The gun fired once. The shell hit at the waterline at the base of the conning tower. It did not explode. 50 yards was too close. The fuse needed more flight time to arm, so 4 inches of steel simply punched through and kept going. The submarine heeled to starboard and went under, straight into the 4 depth charges rolling off the Ward's stern, 4 blasts of the ship's whistle, 1 for each. The sea lifted, settled, and showed oil. It was 6:47. From first sighting to sinking, 10 minutes. At 6:51, Outerbridge radioed the 14th Naval District in plain English on a frequency created for exactly this purpose. We have dropped depth charges upon sub operating in defensive sea area. Then he stopped. Ships had been dropping depth charges on phantom contacts for weeks, and nobody wakes an admiral for that. Firing a gun at a submarine was different. 2 minutes later, he sent a second message, and the second message said everything. Have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon unidentified submarine operating in defensive sea area. A direct hit from our number 3 gun on his conning tower, followed up with 4 ash cans. Oil slick 300 yards astern, visible on surface, Lieutenant William W. Outerbridge, Commanding Officer, USS Ward. That was 6:53. The first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor at 7:55. For 62 minutes, the Pacific Fleet held in its hands a logged, signed report that an enemy submarine had been shot and sunk at the front door of its anchorage. 62 minutes could have been enough to bring 8 battleships to general quarters, man every anti-aircraft gun in the harbor, and put the Army's fighters in the air. None of that happened. How a warning that complete produced nothing at all is a question that would occupy official investigations for years, and this film for the next half hour. And the men who fired that shot were handed a second sentence, quieter and much longer. The submarine sank in 1,200 feet of water and took the proof down with it. For more than 60 years, nobody could show that the Ward had hit anything. The moss should have told them something. That is the report's own word. The submarine was covered with moss, Outerbridge wrote, a sign that it had been at sea for a considerable period. It had. 19 days earlier, on November 18th, 5 big fleet submarines had left Kure, Japan, each with a smaller vessel clamped to its deck. a Type A midget submarine, 78 feet long, battery-driven, carrying 2 torpedoes and 2 men. Japan had prepared this piece of the attack with patience. In late October, a Japanese liner called at Honolulu, and among her crew were 3 naval officers who were not crewmen. One of them, Lieutenant Keiyu Matsuo, was a midget submarine pilot. He spent 2 days studying the approaches to Pearl Harbor and sailed home to brief the others on what the mouth of the harbor looked like. The orders for the 5 boats were strict. Do not force the net barrier at the channel. Forcing it would give the whole game away. Slip in behind an American ship while the gate stood open. Once inside, lie on the bottom and fire the torpedoes in the lull between the first airstrike and the second. Afterward, if there was an afterward, creep out and rendezvous with the mother submarines off the island of Lanai. Of the 10 men who rowed the midgets that night, 2 had volunteered. The other 8 had been rotated into the mission like any ordinary duty assignment, and the enlisted crewmen were told where they were going only after the submarines were already at sea. Between 3:15 and 3:30, in the dark water south of Oahu, 5 submarines put 5 midgets over the side. 5 boats, 10 men in the water before first light. Hold that count of 5. The rest of this story, all 60 years of it, is the accounting. The last one off was crewed by Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki and Chief Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Inagaki, and it was in trouble before it left the deck. The gyro compass was dead. A midget submarine without a gyro compass is a blind man in a current. Sakamaki went anyway. His trim was wrong too, the boat kept breaking the surface, and he navigated the only way left to him, with his periscope up far longer than any periscope should be up. Here is the bitter part. The American system was ready for exactly this. After Washington's war warning of November 27th, Admiral Husband Kimmel had put new rules in force at Pearl Harbor. Any submerged submarine found in the defensive sea area was to be attacked immediately, no permission required. Reports of submarine contacts were to go out in plain voice, no coding delays, on a dedicated frequency with a 24-hour watch. Every rule the Ward would need that morning already existed. Kimmel had written them himself because he believed an air attack on his fleet would announce itself first through submarines. He was right, and it saved nothing. At 3:42 that morning, the minesweeper Condor was working the entrance when her officer of the deck, Ensign Russell McCoy, saw a streak of glowing water 50 yards ahead on the port side. He got 2 more sets of eyes on it, a periscope, and behind it the suggestion of a small conning tower, a silhouette none of them had ever seen in any recognition book. At 3:57, Condor sent it to the Ward by signal lamp and by radio, in the clear, exactly as the new rules required. Sighted submerged submarine on westerly course, speed 9 knots. The shore station at Bishop's Point heard it and logged it. The 14th Naval District's Communications Watch should have heard it too. The lieutenant on watch was asleep. The Ward went to general quarters at 4:08 and hunted eyes and sonar along the course Condor had given. Nothing. At 4:30, she asked Condor for an update and got a negative. At 4:35, she stood her crew down and kept patrolling. At Bishop's Point, the duty officer reasoned it through. The exchange was between 2 ships and not addressed to him. The Ward had found nothing, and there had been false submarine reports for weeks. He filed no report. He also assumed the district's own radio watch had been listening. It had not. Neither ship reported the contact up the chain either, and Outerbridge later explained his own reasoning under oath. Condor had seen the thing, and Condor had not reported it, so perhaps Condor did not really believe it was a submarine. Every man in the loop assumed the next man knew more than he did. The warning died of politeness. At 4 in the morning, 2 hours before a shot was fired. At 4:58, the anti-submarine net at the harbour mouth swung open to let the minesweepers home. Opening and closing the barrier took time, so standing procedure said leave it open if more traffic was due, and the cargo ship Antares was due at 6. Antares never entered Pearl Harbor that day. The gate stood open, waiting for her until 8:40. For nearly 4 hours, the front door of the Pacific Fleet was unlocked, with 5 enemy submarines outside it in the dark. The sun rose at 6:24, behind mountains and cloud. At 6:30, Antares arrived off the entrance, towing a barge, found no tug waiting, and began a slow turn to mark time. On that turn, her lookouts picked up a low shape 1,500 yards off, tucked between the ship and her tow. Her captain, Commander Lawrence Grannis, called it what it was, a submarine, and at 6:37 his radio message went out to the Ward. It is the same minute Herbert Rubig, at the Ward's helm, found the shape with his naked eye. You know the next 10 minutes. One shell over the conning tower, one through it, 4 depth charges, oil on the water. What you have not yet heard is what the warning did next. Because from 6:53 in the morning, the story of the first shot of America's Pacific War stops being a story about gunnery and becomes a story about telephones. Outerbridge's second message, the complete one, was logged at Bishop's Point at 6:53, and it woke the 14th Naval District's communications watch officer at last. He carried it to the district duty officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Kaminsky. Kaminsky tried to telephone the aide to the admiral commanding the district. Busy. He called the fleet duty desk instead and got the assistant duty officer, Lieutenant Commander Black. Black relayed it to the fleet duty officer, Commander Vincent Murphy, the assistant fleet war plans officer, a man who at that moment had on his desk a freshly finished plan completed the day before, for what the fleet should do in the event of a surprise attack. Murphy told Black to call Kaminsky back for details while he got dressed. Black dialed. Busy. Kaminsky, meanwhile, had reached the district chief of staff, Captain John Earl. Earl wanted more information and in the meantime ordered the duty destroyer Monaghan to raise steam and go investigate, which would take 3/4 of an hour. At 7:12, Earl got through to the district commander, Rear Admiral Claude Bloch. The two men weighed it and agreed. Probably another false report. They also agreed to treat it seriously, which in practice meant sending one destroyer to go and look and waiting. When Murphy reached his headquarters, the telephone was already ringing. It was Patrol Wing 2. One of the morning patrol planes had radioed that it had sunk a submerged submarine a mile off the entrance. That was Ensign William Tanner's aircraft, the one that had dropped smoke floats over the Ward's target and then depth charges after her. Tanner had sent his report at 7 o'clock, in code, though the new rules called for plain voice. It took 15 minutes to reach the addressees, and the first response was a request for confirmation. His answer finally went out in plain English. Sunk one enemy sub 1 mile south of Pearl Harbor. So by 7:15, a sunken enemy submarine at the mouth of the harbor had been reported to the fleet twice, through 2 separate channels, a destroyer's and a patrol plane's. Murphy called Admiral Kimmel at home, somewhere between 7:20 and 7:35. Kimmel had risen at 7 for a 9 o'clock golf game with Lieutenant General Walter Short, the commander of the army in Hawaii, the man responsible for the air defense of the island. Kimmel cancelled the golf. He said he would come in, and he waited for confirmation. He said it himself under oath, without decoration. I was awaiting such verification at the time of the attack. It is easy to sneer at that sentence, and most tellings of Pearl Harbor do. It is harder to sit where Kimmel sat. For weeks, the sea around Oahu had produced contact after contact, and every one of them had dissolved into nothing. A wave, a log, a nervous sonar operator. If the fleet had gone to battle stations for each of them, it would have worn itself blunt in a month. The system did not fail because the men in it were fools. It failed because every link waited for the next link to be sure. The telephone exchanges jammed with officers calling each other to ask if anyone was sure, and certainty arrived at 7:55 in the form of a dive bomber. There were small absurdities inside the hour, and each one shaved minutes off it. The Ward, having sunk a submarine, immediately caught a sampan loitering in the restricted zone, put rifle shots across its path, accepted its white flag, and radioed for a Coast Guard cutter, all while her attack reports were still working their way ashore. Officers weighing those reports heard she was now herding a fishing boat and drew the natural conclusion. A captain, with time to chase sampans, cannot be in the middle of anything serious. In the same hour, the Army's radar station at Opana picked up the incoming strike at 7:02 at a range of over 100 miles, and the Army's own chain of assumption and reassurance strangled that warning too. 2 systems, 2 failures, 1 morning, not one call between them. That is the sentence the Navy's own historians land on. It was all too late, and no one called the Army. At 7:51, the duty destroyer Monaghan finally received her orders to get underway and check the Ward's contact. 4 minutes of peace remained. At 7:55, the bombs came. Admiral Kimmel was standing on his front lawn waiting for his car, and from that lawn he watched them fall on his fleet. 10 miles out, the Ward was still shepherding her sampan when the sky over the harbour filled with smoke. On the bridge, the executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Dowdy, said, "They are making a lot of noise over there this morning, Captain." Outerbridge answered, "Yes, I guess they are blasting the new road from Pearl to Honolulu." The only officer in the United States Navy who had already fought the Japanese that morning assumed the explosions were road work. Then, they watched the planes coming straight down out of the climb and understood together. One more detail belongs to this hour, and the Navy's own Chief of Naval History is the one who raised it. Outerbridge's 6:53 message had 3 sentences. The attack, the direct hit from gun number 3, the oil on the water. Almost every account ever written quotes only the first sentence, which forces a question nobody can now answer. Did the whole message travel up the chain that morning, or only its opening line, with the direct hit and the oil slick left behind on a signal pad at Bishop's Point? 62 minutes was the size of the warning. We do not actually know how much of the warning was in it by the time it reached the men who could have acted. The gate the midgets had been promised stood open from 4:58, and at least one of them found it. She idled into the harbour behind some ship's wake, exactly as designed, and she waited out the first airstrike on the bottom, exactly as ordered. At 8:30, in the lull between the two waves, the minesweeper Zane saw a conning tower 200 yards astern of the repair ship Medusa, deep inside the harbour west of Ford Island. The duty destroyer Monaghan was close by, and here the morning produced its blackest joke. Monaghan was underway on Captain Earl's orders, threading past Ford Island toward the entrance, to go investigate the submarine the Ward had already killed. She never got there. On the way, a live one surfaced in front of her. Monaghan's captain, Lieutenant Commander William Burford, rang up flank speed and steered to ram. The midget, under fire from 3 ships at once, got both torpedoes away. The first went at the seaplane tender Curtis, missed her and blew apart a dock at Pearl City. Curtis answered with a 5-inch shell into the conning tower. The second torpedo went at the onrushing Monaghan, slid past her and spent itself against the Ford Island shore. Then Monaghan ran the submarine down, grounded under her keel into the harbour bottom, and dropped 2 depth charges in water so shallow that the blasts threw her own stern around, and she scraped along a derrick barge before Burford got her back in hand. He was awarded the Navy Cross. 2 weeks later, the Navy razed the wreck, and what was left of it was tipped into a construction pit as landfill under a new submarine dock. The Pacific Fleet literally built its base on top of one of the boats sent to destroy it. The pilot of that midget is generally assessed to have been Lieutenant Naoji Iwasa, the senior officer of the midget force and one of its 2 volunteers. A lieutenant's dress blue sleeve was found floating in the harbour afterward, and he was the only lieutenant among the 10. A man rode out on a mission with almost no way home, and he had dressed for it. The harbour was not finished with submarines. At 10:04, after the air attack ended, the light cruiser St. Louis came down the channel at 25 knots, the first major warship to break out. As she cleared the entrance buoys, her lookout saw 2 torpedo tracks inbound from starboard at 2,000 yards. Both torpedoes struck the reef short of her and exploded there. Which of the 5 boats fired them was never established that day. Hold on to those 2 torpedoes. They matter in this story's final act. The Ward herself spent the rest of December 7th doing what she had done at 6:45, over and over. Contact, attack, oil, silence. By the end of the day, she had dropped 172 depth charges. How many submarines were really under them, nobody knows to this day. That night, far out at sea, The mother submarine I-16 heard 3 short words from her midget's radio: C, C, C. Success, sent 3 times. Just after midnight came a second transmission: unable to navigate. That was the last signal any of the 5 midgets ever sent. And Sakamaki, the ensign with the dead compass, was living out the longest day of the 5. He had still been trying to find the entrance when the bombs started falling. Around 8, he put his boat on the reef east of the channel in plain daylight. The destroyer helm saw him hung up there, fired and missed, close enough to slam the little hull like a bell. He worked the boat off the coral. By then, the torpedo tubes were smashed and useless. Seawater was creeping into the batteries, and the batteries were answering with gas. He and Inagaki drifted east along the coast of Oahu all day, in and out of consciousness, while the fumes filled the boat. Near midnight, the surf threw them onto another reef, at Waimanalo Beach. Sakamaki set the scuttling charge, and the 2 men went into the water. Inagaki drowned in the surf. The charge never went off. At dawn on December 8th, an American soldier on beach patrol, Corporal David Akui of the Hawaii National Guard, found a Japanese man collapsed on the sand and took him at pistol point. Prisoner of war number 1 of the United States. The first Japanese soldier ever to question him was Corporal Tsubota, a Japanese-American, a Nisei in an American uniform, and the first thing Sakamaki said in English was, "I am cold." He was sent to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Within months, the same campgrounds held the newly formed 100th Infantry Battalion, Japanese-American volunteers who would become part of the most decorated regiment in American history. America's first prisoner of the war and some of America's most loyal soldiers looked at each other across the same fences. In Japan, they solved the problem of Sakamaki differently. The Navy proclaimed the midget crew's heroes of legend and commissioned a famous painting of them ascending as gods of war. 9 gods, not 10. The man who survived was painted out of existence, his name struck from the roll of honor, because capture was a disgrace the legend could not carry. The same propaganda machine credited the midgets with sinking the battleship Arizona, to the disgust of the aviators who had actually done it. The truth, which Japan's own planners knew, was harsher. The midget operation achieved nothing, and the periscope sightings at 3:42 and 6:37 had come within 1 telephone call of costing the entire attack its surprise, just as the aviators had warned it might. His own boat outlived his disgrace. Salvaged off that reef, patched up, and paraded across America on a war bond tour while its pilot sat in a Wisconsin camp. Sakamaki himself said almost nothing about that morning for decades. He built a life in industry instead, rising through Toyota to the presidency of its Brazilian subsidiary, and in 1991, 50 years after Waimanalo, he traveled to a museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, and stood in front of the boat again. He died in 1999, at 81. He was not the only man from that morning who spent half a century waiting for the record to change. The difference is that the men of the Ward had told the truth at 6:53 and could not prove it. Now put yourself on the other side of the story, in the years after the war, and ask the cold question the Navy's assessors had to ask. What did the Ward actually have? She had testimony. The men on deck swore they saw the shell strike the base of the conning tower, saw no splash beyond, no ricochet, saw the submarine heel over and go down. She had her captain's report, typed 6 days later, and she had nothing else. The submarine had sunk in water too deep for divers, and sonar never found it again. Nothing floated up. No debris, no bodies, no oil that could be trusted, because depth charges churn the sea. His own report from December 1941 mentions a large amount of oil where the charges went off. After the war, Outerbridge was stricter with himself, with a professional's honesty. No, there was no visible evidence. These submarines did not carry oil, and they were electric drive, and there was no wreckage. Asked what his belief in the sinking rested on, he gave 5 words. On the gun hit, only on the gun hit. And then, carefully, I didn't claim a kill. The official record reflected that caution. The Joint Congressional Investigation concluded that only one midget submarine had penetrated Pearl Harbor, the one Monaghan crushed, and that the midget force accomplished nothing. The Ward's submarine appears in the histories as a claim. Probably true, never proven. And in the gap between probably and proven, the doubters moved in, and they had a specific, comfortable target. The gun crew. Because who, after all, had fired that miracle shot? Not Annapolis men, not career gunners. The Ward's enlisted crew was overwhelmingly Naval Reservists from St. Paul, Minnesota, and the paperwork of their arrival survives in the National Archives. The ship's report of changes for January 1941. Line after line with the same entry. Received on board January 29th, 1941. Enlisted at St. Paul. Unit, 47th Division, 11th Battalion, United States Naval Reserve. Their battalion was called to federal service on January 21st. They reported on the 23rd, and on the 29th they climbed onto the deck of a 23-year-old destroyer that had been in mothballs 2 weeks before. 8 days from a Minnesota armory to a warship. Their names are on those pages. Ambrose Donegal, Joseph Durder, Clarence Fenton, Harold Flanagan, Joseph Flugel, Louis Gerner. Weekend sailors, the doubters said. Just a bunch of reservists. 10 months out of civilian life, on a moving ship, against a moving target the size of a rowboat's cabin, with one round. Men like that do not make that shot. They saw a splash and called it a hit, and the excitement of the morning did the rest. If your father, or your grandfather, or your uncle served aboard the USS Ward, or came out of that St. Paul Reserve Battalion, put his name and his rate in the comments. The archives hold these men in single-typed lines. The stories that go with them live in families now, and one typed comment puts a man back into the record. The men themselves never wavered, and they organized. After the war, the Ward's Pearl Harbor crew formed an association in St. Paul. The first shot naval vets and met every December 7th. In 1958, the Navy did something quietly remarkable for them. It took gun number 3, which had been removed when the ship was rebuilt in 1943, and preserved for its historic significance, and loaned it to the state of Minnesota. It was dedicated on the grounds of the state capitol in St. Paul in May 1958, and the 9 men of its wartime crew stood beside it at the ceremony. Picture that scene. A state monument, 9 middle-aged Minnesotans in their best suits, a 4-inch gun pointed at the prairie sky, and 17 years on, still no proof anywhere on Earth that its one famous shot had ever struck home. They would grow old inside that asterisk. The Navy honored them, journalists interviewed them, and the histories kept the careful word, claimed. Then the sea began, very slowly, to give up the evidence, one boat at a time. Every recovery redrew the ledger of the 5, and every recovery failed to answer the only question that mattered in St. Paul. Where was the Ward's submarine? 1960. A Navy diver training in Ko-hyoteki Lagoon, just east of the harbor entrance, swam into a midget submarine sitting in 75 feet of water. Both torpedoes still in the tubes, scuttling charge intact, hatch open, crew gone, nothing left of them but shoes and clothing. The Navy raised her and Japan asked for her. She stands today at the Naval Academy at Etajima, restored, a memorial. That accounted for a 3rd boat, alongside the one Monaghan crushed and the one Sakamaki lost. The 4th took 3 tries. In 1992, a University of Hawaii research submersible found the stern section of a midget in 1,200 feet of water in an old munitions dumping ground off the harbor. In 2000, the midsection turned up nearby. In 2001, the forward section, with its net cutter, and with both torpedo tubes empty. The boat had been blown into 3 pieces by a scuttling charge and at some point raised, towed out, and dumped by somebody who kept no records. Empty tubes? Fired at what? That question reopened the oldest argument about Pearl Harbor. Had a second midget made it inside and fired at Battleship Row? Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that at least one got in. Rear Admiral Edwin Layton, the fleet's intelligence officer on the morning of the attack, wrote, at least 2. A fleet report of February 1942 mentions an unexploded torpedo recovered from the battleship row area with a 1,000-pound warhead, when the aerial torpedoes dropped that morning carried 449 pounds, and the midget's own just over 700. And there is the famous photograph, taken from a Japanese torpedo plane at the height of the attack. In the frame, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and California are already spilling oil, and Arizona has not yet been destroyed. In mid-frame sits a small black shape, trailing what some interpret as propeller spray. A 2010 analysis for the television program Nova argued that the shape is a midget submarine in the act of firing at Battleship Row. Most historians answer, the spray casts no shadow. The shape is likelier a film flaw, a buoy, or a shell splash, and the midget's own plan for bait firing during the air attack. The Navy's chief historian, walking through all of it, lands on the sober side. The three-piece boat most likely never entered the harbor at all, waited outside, and fired both torpedoes at St. Louis as she came out at 10:04. Those are the two torpedoes that hit the reef. He closes his review with a warning that the argument will not end, and it has not. But notice what every version of the count had in common: rammed boat, beached boat, lagoon boat, three-piece boat. 4. The fifth, the one the Ward swore it sank at 6:45 in the morning, an hour before the war, was not on anyone's ledger. 60 years of salvage, surveys, and accidents had turned up every midget submarine of the Pearl Harbor force except the first one. The one that mattered most. It was not where it was supposed to be. And as long as it was missing, the 9 men from St. Paul were exactly what the skeptics said they were: a gun crew with a story. On August 28, 2002, the University of Hawaii's 2 research submersibles, Pisces 4 and Pisces 5, went down on a training and test dive off Pearl Harbor. Not an expedition. A shakedown, crews drilling, instruments being calibrated in an area 5 miles off the harbor mouth and well to the east, outside the old defensive sea area, which is precisely why no search had ever crossed it. At 1,312 feet, a shape resolved out of the dark. 78 feet long. The distinctive net cutter of the Pearl Harbor force on its forward end. Both torpedoes still sleeping in their tubes. And on the starboard side, at the base of the conning tower, a hole 4 inches across. The Navy's official history states the meaning of that hole without blinking. It is exactly where the Ward's gunners said they hit the midget on December 7, 1941. After enduring years of doubters questioning whether their gunnery could have really been that good, especially since they were just a bunch of reservists. Every detail that had made the claim unprovable in 1941 now locked into place as proof. The shot was fired from 50 yards, too close for the fuse to arm, so the shell did not explode. That is why there was no blast, no debris field, no wreckage on the surface, nothing for 1941 to photograph. It punched clean through the base of the tower, was deflected downward inside the hull, and went out through the underside. Through that wound, the boat kept gliding as she flooded, a long, shallow, dying slope that carried her 1.5 miles from where the Ward reported the sinking, over the line of the restricted zone, off every chart anyone would ever search. The same 50 yards that made the shot unmissable made it unprovable for 60 years. The proof was always down there, 4 inches wide, waiting for a camera. 1 round, 1 hit. At the waterline junction of hull and conning tower, from the deck of a moving 23-year-old destroyer, by a gun crew 10 months removed from Minnesota. The shot the doubters said could not have happened is now among the best documented single rounds of the Second World War. 60 years and 8 months separate the gun's recoil from the photograph of its work. The submarine was left where she lies. Most analysts conclude she is the boat launched from the submarine I-20, crewed by Ensign Akira Hiru and Petty Officer Second Class Yoshio Katayama, and if that attribution is right, the 2 of them are still aboard. The United States and Japan agreed to treat the site as a war grave, and American agencies now watch over it under that agreement. The wreck confirmed the marksmanship of one navy, and it holds the dead of the other, and both countries decided the ocean should keep it. The Ward herself never got to hear any of it, because the Ward did not survive the war. She earned 9 battle stars. Rebuilt as a fast transport, she carried Army Rangers into the mouth of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the opening move of the greatest naval battle ever fought. And on December 7th, 1944, 3 years to the day after her 10 minutes off Pearl Harbor, she was steaming in Ormoc Bay in the Philippines when the kamikazes came for the task force. A twin-engine bomber flew into her portside 8 inches above the waterline. Its engines tore through the hull and out below the waterline on the far side. The space it hit had once been boiler room number 1 and was now a troop compartment, and within 20 minutes the fire there was beyond controlling, with the forward magazine impossible to flood. Her captain, Lieutenant Richard Farwell, ordered abandon ship, and the crew went over reluctantly. Every man came off alive. Given what the hit looked like, that borders on the miraculous. The task force commander decided that towing her back to Leyte under continuing air attack was too great a risk to the other ships, and ordered her sunk by gunfire. The nearest destroyer was the O'Brien, a new ship that had shelled the Normandy coast on D-Day before coming to the Pacific. Her commanding officer was Commander William Outerbridge. The War Diary of the Transport Division wrote it down that same month in the flattest staff prose imaginable. By a strange coincidence, the commanding officer of the O'Brien, Commander W. Outerbridge, USN, was the commanding officer of the Ward on the historic morning of December 7th, 1941, approximately 1 hour before the initial enemy attack. On December 7th, 1944, he sunk his previous command on orders. The Ward's own captain had been taken aboard the O'Brien, so both of her captains, first and last, stood on the same deck for it. The O'Brien's opening salvo detonated the Ward's after magazine, and she went down in 119 fathoms. Asked about it long afterward, Outerbridge said, "It just was something that had to be done." He had been awarded the Navy Cross for the morning of December 7th, 1941. He retired a rear admiral and died in Georgia in 1986. And in 2017, the search ship Petrel, funded by Paul Allen, found the Ward on the floor of Ormoc Bay, 700 feet down. So, both vessels of that first fight now lie found on the bottom of the same ocean. The Hunter, located in 2017. The Hunted in 2002, 700 feet and 1,300 feet, 3,000 miles apart, sunk 3 years to the day apart, and connected forever by 50 yards. One artifact of that morning is still above water, and it is on the move as you watch this. Gun number 3 came off the Ward in the 1943 rebuild and was saved because of what it had done. Minnesota got her on loan in 1958, and for 67 years it stood on the state capitol grounds in St. Paul, through every December 7th reunion of the First Shot Naval Vets, through the 2002 discovery that turned it from a claim into a fact, through the funerals of the men who served it. On September 2nd, 2025, it was lifted off its pedestal and taken away for restoration. When the new Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum opens at Camp Ripley in the summer of 2026, the gun goes on permanent display indoors, out of the weather, for good. Nothing in this film is reconstructed dialogue or documentary folklore. The report Outerbridge typed 6 days after the attack is in the National Archives, and we pulled the original scan. It is where the 50 yards comes from, a number garbled into 560 in later transcriptions, sitting plain and clean on the 1941 page. The January 1941 report of changes is there too. The St. Paul men entered line by line. 47th Division, 11th Battalion, received on board January 29th. The war diary that recorded Outerbridge sinking his own first command was written by a staff officer that same December. The paper survived. The boat survived, 5 miles out and a quarter mile down. The proof survived. Only the waiting was long. Herbert Roebig saw a periscope where no periscope should be, and told the next man, and the next man told the captain, and the captain fired and then told the fleet, and the fleet did not believe it in time. That chain of telling is the whole story of the morning of December 7th. The men of the Ward did their part of it in 10 minutes flat, and then spent 60 years being doubted for doing it perfectly. If they deserve anything from us, It is the one thing the system denied them that morning: to be heard the first time. Leave a word below for the reservists of the 47th Division, 11th Battalion, and for two young men from Japan still standing watch inside their boat, 1,300 feet down. Just let us know you're here. That is how the names stay spoken. That is how a 4-inch hole in the dark stays what it finally became. Not a claim, a fact.